Hello everyone, this is your instructor Kwame Shen, and this lecture is part 3 of our lecture on eukaryotic classification. In this lecture, we'll look at the phylum Nematoda, the roundworms. We'll look at the phylum Annelida, the segmented worms, and then the phylum Arthropoda, where we'll just look at the insects and the arachnids. For the phylum Nematoda, these are the roundworms. They are microscopic, so you can see them without the help of microscopes. They are multicellular, and therefore they are eukaryotic. They are referred to as pseudocoelomates, and what it means is that their body cavity, the cavity within which the organs of the organism are contained, or in which the organs will inhabit, are derived from the body cavity of the embryo, and not the body cavity that is formed from the mesoderm. So we have organisms that are referred to as the true coelomates. So they have a true coelom. For the true coelomates, their body cavity is formed from the mesoderm layer of the embryo. For the false coelomates, theirs is formed from the body cavity within the embryo, so not from a layer. So the phylum Nematoda, in terms of the roundworms, they are referred to as pseudocoelomates. They have a complete digestive system, so they can break down their own food, although most of them are parasitic, so they will depend on food that probably is already digested, but if it's not, they can actually break it down. They are very diverse. We have over 28,000 of them that have been described, and of this number, you have about 16,000 of them that are parasites, and they're very common in the seabeds of the oceans as well. Most of them are dioecious, meaning that one organism would have both the male and female reproductive structures within it. The main groups that we have within the nematodes in terms of the classes are the class Cecynanthia and Adenophoria. Still on the roundworms, we have the free-living flatworms that are part of them. They belong to the subkingdom Invertebrata, the kingdom Animalia. They are long, cylindrical, and tapering. Tapering in that their body would typically present this way, so that the ends tapers off. They have a cuticle, a covering around a sheet of tissue around their body that gives them protection, because they are parasites and they inhabit usually the colon or the blood vessels of their host. In terms of how they reproduce and the strategies that they use in terms of how they propagate themselves and infect new hosts, there are a number of them. They are intestinal nematodes. They will shed their eggs into the lumen of the intestine of the host, and then it will pass out through the feces. It will contaminate food or water, and then when someone else eats that food or drinks the water, they are then transmitted, and then the cycle continues. Then there are larvae. There are some larvae that will bore through the skin and penetrate the skin, and that is how they infect the host. There are others that will encyst in the muscle, and so when the muscle is consumed as food, it's not cooked well, they are then transmitted. And then you have others that are transmitted by vectors such as mosquitoes. The adults become sexually matured in the definitive host, and in the instance where human beings are typically the definitive host, in terms of the ones that we're looking at, the sexual maturity will take place in the humans. So the first group that we'll look at are the Ascariasis. Ascariasis is a disease that is caused by Ascaris lumbricoides. So once you're infected with Ascaris lumbricoides, you suffer from Ascariasis. It's endemic in rural southeast United States. It's the most common nematode or worm infection in the world. You have over 1 billion people that are infected every year. Over 200,000 eggs that are laid every day by this particular pathogen. That's a lot of eggs. And it's transmitted through water or food contamination. The adults are dioecious. When they are within the body, when the eggs are ingested, it will mature into an adult. The adult will inhabit first the intestine because it's ingested through food or water, and then it will end up going through the circulatory system, the lungs, the pharynx, and the intestine. It is then, once it ends up in the intestine, it will then release eggs again, and then eggs are released into the environment. So that's how the system operates. And this is a picture giving an idea of the length of an Ascaris lumbricoides. Most people are asymptomatic, so you didn't see any symptoms in most people. However, for some individuals, there is a very heavy worm burden, and when there is a heavy worm burden, it results in abdominal pain, or it could cause intestinal obstruction. In those instances, the way to deal with them is, once they're diagnosed, is to offer surgery when the burden is very heavy. The burden is not that heavy. They could be treated with albendazole, anti-helmintic drugs, or mebendazole. Diagnosis could be done through fecal analysis when the eggs are identified, through sputum analysis when the larvae is identified, or very rarely when the organism may exit the individual through the mouth or the nose. You can prevent this infection by proper sanitation, good sewage treatment, and just good hygiene practices, and it can easily be prevented. The second group that we'll look at in the phylum Nematoda are the hookworms. And for the hookworms, we have two types that we'll look at: the Cylostoma duodenale and Eukaryotes americanus. These groups are the second most common causes of worm infection in the world. So you have about 600 million people being infected every year. Based on geographical distribution, you would have the Cylostoma duodenale being worldwide distributed, whilst Eukaryotes americanus is more common in North America. In terms of transmission, the eggs are passed out in stools. They will hatch in the soil, and then the larvae that will develop from the eggs will then burrow through the skin of an individual who comes into contact with that contaminated soil. If they burrow through the skin, they'll get into the circulatory system, enter the lungs and the heart, burrow through the esophagus, and then end up in the intestine, where they will mature and mate. And so this is how it presents once you have a weak hookworm infection. That's how it presents. The burrowing through the skin presents these symptoms, especially on the lower extremities. Now, for Cylostoma duodenale, it is characterized by two pairs of teeth. So this is one pair, and that's the second pair. Eukaryotes americanus is characterized by semi-lunar plates. So they look like half moons, semi-lunar plates. That's the characteristic features. In terms of the symptoms, there is a chronic anemia and deficiency in protein as well. They are diagnosed using the eggs from from contaminated feces, or from the presence of anemia or blood as well in the feces. It can be treated with albendazole, mebendazole, or through surgery. And just like that's the the other nematode, which causes Ascariasis, Ascarias lumbricoides, it can be prevented through personal hygiene, generally. Morphologically, the two species that we're looking at, Cylostoma duodenale and Ecata americanus, they only define geographical distribution. I mean, where they're from. Cylostoma is worldwide. Ecata is North America. You find differences in size as well, and then the main difference is in the teeth, where Cylostoma duodenale has 2 pairs of teeth, and Ecata americanus has semilunar blades. In terms of life cycle, you have a few details that I want to point out here on this slide. That when the eggs hatch into a larvae, there is a first larvae known as the rhabditiform larvae. The rhabditiform larvae is more of a feeding stage where it does a lot of feeding, but that stage is not infective. And then the rhabditiform larvae will then develop into a filariform larvae. It is the filariform larvae that is infective. It is that larvae that will be able to bore through the skin and then eventually become effective to the individual. The adults will end up in the intestines, where they will mature and where the eggs will be released and shed into the environment, and then the cycle continues. Then the pinworms are another group of organisms known as the Enterobius vermicularis. We have about 500 million infections worldwide, 40 million in the United States. It's endemic in temperate regions and areas where there's overcrowding, so the homeless facilities and refugee camps and the likes. Humans are the only known hosts. So in terms of transmission, humans are the only known hosts. The female pinworms would then release their eggs in the perianal regions of humans. So as I have in the picture here, these are all eggs that have been deposited there. So the male, the male and the female will mate in the intestine. The female will then migrate to the perianal area, release the eggs. The eggs will then hatch into larvae, and one of the symptoms, that is, if the symptoms do present, because usually they are asymptomatic, but when the person or the individual who is infected has symptoms, the distinct symptom will be the itching of the perianal area, intense itching, and so the person generally would be scratching it. Now, if you scratch and you don't exercise personal hygiene, then you're more likely to help with the transmission, contaminate food or water, and then the cycle continues. However, if there is an early diagnosis through dislodging of the eggs using tapes, so we either use tapes or cellophane, and it has to be done during the night or at dawn. That's when the female descends to the anal region to lay the eggs. It can, however, be treated by mebendazole or parental palmoids. By good personal hygiene and sanitation is able to also stem the transmission. Then you have the Filaria worms, which causes filariasis. An example is Eukaryotes bancrofti. Eukaryotes bancrofti is implicated in elephantiasis, where the worm blocks the lymphatic system and causes the buildup of lymph in the lower extremities, as you see in the picture. So the Filaria worms do not infect the intestinal tract, they infect the lymphatic system. So that's an important distinction. It's endemic in Africa, in India, in Asia, in South America. The worms are transmitted by mosquito. The mosquito will pick the microfilaria, the stage of the filaria worm that it picks, and then once it bites someone, it gets into the circulatory system and eventually gets into the lymphatic vessels. They have evolved such that during the day they are not active, they just rest in the limbs. During the night they end up in the circulatory system, and when mosquitoes feed on blood of individuals during the night, it's end up picking these worms, and then it's transmitted to the next person when they bite another person. So symptoms are filariasis, that is infection of the larvae, and then you have fever, chills, and then elephantiasis. In terms of diagnosis, when the microfilaria is found in blood smears, that's a good indication that someone is infected with the filaria worms. Then you have trichinosis. Trichinosis, these are thread-like pock worms, and this is how they present. This is an encysted worm, so the worm has fixed itself in the blood, in the tissue, in terms of the muscle tissue of the host. This is how they appear. So that's why we describe them as thread worm. Pork or swine is one of the common hosts where you find the worms in the muscles. So when they are undercooked or raw and they're eaten, they're easily transmitted to another organism, in this case humans. So they're the smallest human nematode parasites. They will mature in the intestines as well, and once they consume, they will enter the intestinal wall, then into the circulatory system, the lymphatics. Eventually they will end up in the muscles where they will encyst there. And then the symptoms are general malaise, weakness, there is fever and heart damage, and it co-results in death. Now, for diagnosis to occur, there has to be a muscle biopsy where the worms are then identified. Then we have the phylum Annelida. The phylum Annelida are the segmented worms. So in terms of the morphology, we see that they are ring. So they have the ringworm and the segmented worms. They're also macroscopic, so we can see them with our naked eye. They are multicellular. Good examples of them are earthworms and lychees and ragworms. They have a complete digestive system as well. The main groups of the annelids in terms of the classes are the Polychaeta, the Elosomata as well. And then the subclasses, we have Oligochaeta, the Heridina, and Clytellata. We will concentrate I'll just briefly talk about the Heridina. The Heridina, because they are the lychees. They are freshwater types, they are marine types. They carry what we call a clitellum. A clitellum is a very thick glandular area of the body that is not segmented, and in this area the lychees will secrete a sac-like substance in which it will store its eggs. They are hermaphroditic, and some of them will feed on blood. So for instance, you have the lychees that will feed on blood. Then we have the phylum Arthropoda, the arthropods. They are mainly vectors of diseases, and that's why they are of interest to us. So they carry organisms that are pathogenic. We have those that have segments, so they have segmented bodies. They will have a hard exoskeleton and jointed legs, and they have different vector types. They may carry the pathogens accidentally. In this case, they are mechanical carriers, or the pathogen will enter their bodies and go through its own metamorphosis in the body, and then they will then transmit the infection as well. So they belong to the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Arthropoda, subphylum Chelicerata, and the class Arachnida. We'll look at the arachnids briefly. So for the arachnids, they have 8 legs, and the 8 legs is because they have 2 additional appendages. They have the chelicerae and the pedipalps in addition to their walking legs. So those are parts of their mouth parts. They have an exoskeleton. They have no antennae or wings, but they have what we call tagmata. That is, their bodies have distinct divisions. So you have the head and the thorax and the abdomen. For the arachnids, you have the cephalon and the thorax. And then you also have the abdomen. There are over 100,000 different species. So you have the spider, the scorpions, and the ticks all being part of this group. So this is an example of an arachnid that was discovered, and it was pictured in the Middle East. If you see this picture is a hoax, in that you see how huge it looks compared to the leg of the soldier. It's way smaller than that. So we have the ticks and the mites, which I'll talk about. They are 6-legged in terms of their juvenile. So the juvenile has 6 legs, the mature will have 8. They are endemic worldwide, and they are very important vectors of bacteria, viruses, and some protozoans. So if you take a pathogen like Borrelia burgdorferi, which causes Lyme disease, it is transmitted by ticks, and so they are very important vectors of some of these pathogens. Their life cycles are generally long, goes through different seasons. So in addition to Lyme disease, you have tularemia, you have encephalitis, rickettsia diseases, and the likes that are caused by the mites and the ticks. So if you look at the life cycle I was just mentioning a moment ago. So for instance, if you look at the ticks, you have the life cycle going all year round. So you have the eggs that are released, the larvae is hatched. You're talking about May, June, July. Around August, September, you have the larvae. The larvae would then develop into nymphs, and you're talking October, November, December, and then the nymphs would then become parasites of small rodents, and then they will then become parasites of large rodents, and so it's a very long life cycle. This is a soft body tick, and then you have hard body ticks as well. For the hard body ticks, they wait to jump on their hosts. They hunt for skin. They're able to cut through it, and then they're able to glue the skin as well. And so they feed on blood. They have a life cycle consisting of an egg, larvae, nymph, and an adult stage. So that's what we call a complete life cycle. And that's how a hard body tick appears. For mites are implicated in scabies. So they could cause scabies. An example of a mite that does that is the Sarcoptes scabies. They have 4 stages as well: egg, larvae, nymph, and adults. And they will burrow into the skin, deposit their eggs, and then the eggs will hatch into larvae, which is 6-legged, and then it will then burrow and molt into the adult form. The adult female are permanently fertilized, and so once they are fertilized for life. and they can lay their eggs in that setting for a long period of time. They could cause scabies, as you can see in this diagram here. Then you have the mites. The mites, you have the H mites that causes scabies. You have the dust mite, and the dust mite is found generally in the house dust. It will feed on organic waste such as human skin, and they are implicated in diseases such as asthma. This brings us to the end of part 3 of our lecture on classification of eukaryotes.